The unimaginable brutality in Bucha, Ukraine. Traumatized residents tell us about mass graves and the execution of innocent civilians by Russian troops who've now been driven out.
Now they've gone, we're beginning to get a fuller picture of the terrible toll inflicted on the civilian population here.
Meanwhile, airstrikes hit critical infrastructure in Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa.
More than a month into this war, it remains beyond the reach of Russian soldiers, but well within the range of Russia's missiles.
Good evening. The town of Bucha is destined to become synonymous with some of the worst atrocities so far uncovered in Ukraine. After the Russian withdrawal, the bodies of dozens of civilians have been found on the streets and in mass graves, some with signs of torture. The revelations have sparked international outrage. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss called them appalling acts which must be investigated as war crimes. Within the last hour, Russia has responded to the accusations by claiming not a single resident of Bucha was harmed and that pictures of atrocities are faked. But our correspondent Dan Rivers was there in person today and saw the evidence for himself. Here's his report, which contains some very distressing scenes.
At the gateway to Bucha and Hostomel, there are the mangled remains of Russian vehicles and the blown bridge which marks the extent of their advance. And nearby, the burnt bodies of soldiers killed here by a Ukrainian counter-offensive. Gruesome sentinels to a battlefield in which dated Russian machinery was pitted against the latest Western-supplied anti-tank weapons. And this was the result, a rewriting of the orthodoxy about Russia's perceived military strength. Some of the Russians who sought to occupy this commuter town near Kyiv will probably never leave. Thanks to one man's war, the remains may never be repatriated or possibly even identified.
This is the most potent symbol of the Russian defeat here in Bucha, a street choked with the charred remains of their tanks and armoured vehicles. Now they've gone, we're beginning to get a fuller picture of the terrible toll inflicted on the civilian population here.
War, in all its grotesque brutality, has turned these streets into a hell from which there is no triumph. Massacres of Ukrainian men have been uncovered by the army here. The war crimes committed here mark a bleak new low in this conflict, described by Ukraine as the most outrageous atrocity of the 21st century. This man in neighbouring Hostomel tells me about the rape and murder of a young woman at the hands of two Chechen soldiers, who he and another local man later killed in revenge. For the civilians like Maxim Skripnik caught between the two sides, there was little to do but pray for deliverance.
The main terrible feelings was in the hearts and minds of private people, I mean the civilian people.
Some of the dead were buried by their neighbours close to the shattered remains of their homes. This is where Ina lies, hit by a shell, her grave adorned with food and drink her relatives would have traditionally shared at her funeral. But her son has been unable to reach the town to grieve for his mother. But many more were hastily interred without headstones or even identification. Here, it's believed 280 people were buried in mass graves, one row for Ukrainians, one for Russians.
This is horrible. We survived this. They were shelling us. I cannot find words to describe what we lived through.
This family appear to have escaped unscathed after days in a bunker, until you know Dima's father was detained by the Russians and never seen again. As he swings, he says, if the bad men come back, I'll stamp on them. Dan Rivers, ITV.
And Dan is back in Kyiv now. Dan, it must have been a truly harrowing day there in Bucha. The brutality that you have been told about verges on the unspeakable almost.
Yeah, and there's been a chorus of condemnation from Western countries today, from France, the US, UK
and most strongly from Ukraine itself. Tonight, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, talked about Russia's despicable attacks against innocent civilians and accused them of committing war crimes. He said no denial or disinformation from the Kremlin can hide what we all know to be the truth. Putin is desperate, his invasion is failing, and Ukraine's resolve has never been stronger. Russia has responded, suggesting that these scenes are in some ways faked. They've talked about them being the latest provocation by Ukraine. But from what we've seen on the ground, there's no doubt that there were executions, there were rapes in these areas, that there was a reign of terror and death in the places that Russia occupied.
Dan in Kyiv, thank you. Well, while Russian forces abandon the north of Ukraine, their attacks in the south are continuing and spreading. The port of Odessa was hit by Russian airstrikes for the first time this morning. The explosions jolting the city awake, including our correspondent there, John Ray.
Any lingering illusion that the people of Odessa might escape this war unscathed have been shattered. First light broken by half a dozen explosions, and then columns of thick, choking smoke, an ominous signal of a new front on the Black Sea coast. Russia said the target was an oil refinery and storage depot. There were secondary explosions as fuel tanks ignited. All this not far from a residential area in the city's suburbs.
The explosion was so loud and so powerful that it blew the roof off my friend's house.
It looked like a one-sided fight against the flames. What burns here is literally the fuel of Ukraine's resistance. Odessa is Ukraine's main maritime link to the outside world. It is central to the defense of this country. More than a month into this war, it remains beyond the reach of Russian soldiers, but well within the range of Russia's missiles. Some fear Odessa is next in line for sustained attack. Ukraine demands from the West advanced defense systems. Every bomb that falls on our cities is a black mark against the nations that decide to withhold help, said President Zelensky. To the east, Russian TV showed its soldiers fighting for what remains of Mariupol, though these censored and sanitized images barely hint at the suffering of the thousands still trapped in the ruined city. Its destruction leaves Odessa as Ukraine's last big outlet to the sea. There are dark days ahead on the Black Sea coast. John Ray, ITV News, Odessa.
Well, here, the government has ruled out the idea of rationing oil and gas in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and soaring energy prices. Instead, the UK's long-term energy strategy is likely to focus on increasing nuclear and wind power.
Hungarians have been voting today after an election campaign dominated by the war in neighbouring Ukraine. The Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who has been seen as close to President Putin, is seeking a fourth term in office. He's facing an alliance of 6 opposition parties. The results should be known later this evening. The National Election Office says so far turnout sits at 63%.